Welcome to Europe Poverty to Prosperity, Week 1, Part 2. I want to tell you a little bit about how I became interested in poverty studies. And you can see in this photo two very important people, Helen McNeve Tyson, who died in 2005, and Rosemary McNeve, her sister, over here on the right, who died in 2012. I met the McNeve sisters quite a number of years ago when I was at Thomas More College in Crestview Hills, Kentucky, and found that they were very dedicated to the poor. And they were both wealthy individuals. And Helen McNeve Tyson has a particularly beautiful story, and I'm going to tell it in a minute. But first I want to tell a little bit about the story of Rosemary McNeve. Rosemary served as a principal, a teacher and principal, mainly in the Cincinnati Public Schools, including the very poor Washington Park School in Over the Rhine. And she was involved with her sister in a number of charitable enterprises, and was also involved right after World War II in helping veterans who were disabled during the course of World War II. And then Helen McNeve Tyson over here was president of the 13,000 chapters in the United States and something like a 10-11 million member National Council of Catholic Women. The National Council of Catholic Women. And she was president of that from 1958 to 1960. And at that time, she became very good friends with Eileen Egan, who was the director of Catholic Social Services in Washington, D.C. And the two of them decided that they wanted to bring awareness to the work of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Now, the reason why this was significant is Mother Teresa of Calcutta was born in Albania in southeastern Europe, and she left there in 1929 to go to work in India. And originally Mother Teresa worked as a history teacher in a private girls' high school, which mainly served girls in Calcutta from wealthy families who wanted a European education. And then she sort of found herself called to helping the poor. So Mother Teresa founded her own Missionaries of Charity, a group of sisters, and so forth, that worked with the poorest of the poor in India and then later on throughout the world. And they opened even a house of death. There was nowhere for some of the very poor to go in Calcutta, and she and her sisters in the congregation would literally pick up dying, homeless, and lonely people out of the gutters of Calcutta and take them to a place where they could, in a hospice kind of environment, die with respect and dignity and love. And that was one of her many charitable works other than feeding the poor and etc. But the reason why all this is significant is Mother Teresa began her journey and work in India in 1929. 31 years later, in 1960, Mother Teresa had never stepped foot outside of India. And then she received an invitation from Helen McNeve Tyson of Covington, then president of the National Council of Catholic Women, and Eileen Egan of Catholic Social Services to speak at the National Council of Catholic Women's annual convention in 1960. And the topic of that was women in the 60s. The convention was held, of all places, in Las Vegas, Nevada. So Helen Tyson and Eileen McNeve were responsible for introducing Mother Teresa to the rest of the world and Mother Teresa came to that convention, and it was the beginning of her many appearances around the world. I had the opportunity to meet Mother Teresa, at least to listen to her and see her from a distance, and then she passed by me. And that was in 1982 when she came through this area to speak and to form a missionary of charity in a location in Appalachia. Helen Tyson and Rosemary McNee became very good friends of Mother Teresa, and literally sent her much money across the course of the years, visited her at her house of dying in Calcutta, and even served as advisors to Mother Teresa when Mother Teresa decided to open up I believe it was in the 1990s, a home for AIDS patients in New York City. Well, everybody knows about Mother Teresa, but being so close to two women who were so involved with her life, talked of her constantly, really kind of changed my life forever. And I give a little bit of a quotation here from Mother Teresa. She said, "There's much suffering in the world, physical, material, mental. The suffering of some can be blamed on the greed of others." This course is going to look a little bit at that. The material and physical suffering is suffering from hunger, from homelessness, from all kinds of diseases. But interestingly enough, she says, the greatest suffering is being lonely, feeling unloved, having no one. Mother Teresa says, "I have come more and more to realize that it is being unwanted that is the worst disease that any human being can ever experience." My interest in poverty studies continued with my work on the board of a local church, a Mother of God church in Covington, Kentucky, which is located in the urban area in the inner city. And we were very much involved, that church, in founding a homeless shelter, a shelter for homeless women and children, in working with alcoholics, with a Alcoholics Anonymous group, of working with the poor in general in the area, through our St. Vincent de Paul Society, through the parish kitchen, which the parish founded some years earlier and which still exists today, and which offers a noonday meal, 365 days a week to the poor. Also during my researches, I was asked by St. Elizabeth Healthcare, which is the largest employer in northern Kentucky with over 7,300 employees. Dr. Brian Hacken and I were asked to head up an exhibit and write a book on St. Elizabeth Healthcare. And it was so interesting to find, again, women, important women, in this case Henrietta Esther Scott Cleveland of Covington, and her counterpart Sarah Worthington King Peter of Cincinnati, who did marvelous work on behalf of veterans, on behalf of poor and women, and founded a couple of hospitals, one in Cincinnati, St. Mary Hospital, Sarah Worthington King Peter, and then the two of them, St. Elizabeth Hospital in 1861 in Covington. So my career, my research interest, my interest in terms of my community activity has revolved a great deal around the poor, and studying and reading and researching the plight of the poor, not only in the past, but also in the present day. Now, this class examines poverty, prosperity, and the economic development of Europe. In fact, the class is entitled Europe from Poverty to Prosperity. And the reason for that is Europe in the Middle Ages was one of the poorest places in the world. But it becomes one of the most prosperous places in the world, hence poverty to prosperity. I have a trilogy of courses that I've developed here at NKU, which plays with that terminology. One of them is called India, Prosperity to Poverty, which is just the reverse of our European course, because in the Middle Ages, and certainly by the time of the 1500s, India was one of the most prosperous places on earth, and however it became one of the most impoverished, as we know through the work of Mother Teresa and others. And then a new course also entitled The United States, Poverty in the Midst of Prosperity. Now, of course, it is impossible to discuss any of the above topics, poverty, prosperity, or economic development, especially from the 19th century forward to the present day, without discussing the global economy. We have to talk about the economy of the United States, which is the world's largest. We need to talk about the growing economies like China and India and other places. And since we live in a global economy, we can't just take, from the 19th century on Europe and isolate it to the side. Hence, topics such as industrialization, urbanization, imperialism, that is colonialism, and globalization are inescapable. These intricate connections mean that we'll be referring quite often to other parts of the world, especially the United States. If you choose a topic related to any week's readings that involves a nation outside of Europe, that is perfectly acceptable. I encourage you to use your creativity and your critical thinking skills in making connections between classes that you've taken and are taking. Now, we're actually starting at the end. And the reason why I think we're going to start at the end in the 21st century is I think this is a very good teaching device. We know the present day better than we know 300-400 years ago, right, when we discuss something like the economy. And so that's one thing. So we're relating it. It's always best to learn from where you are, what you know first. And then the second thing, in history, we want to see how we got to the present day. So first, let's all agree on what the present day is and what problems and challenges and solutions it may present to us. And then after we've looked at the present day, we're going to see how the past from ancient and medieval Europe builds up to the present day. World news today is filled with references to the global economy, particularly news about the growing inequality gap. And this inequality gap is twofold. It's a growing inequality within many individual nations, including those in Europe. And it's an inequality between, secondly, nations themselves, especially between developed nations and developing nations. This course is designed to introduce you to the terminology, the history, the themes, even the rhetoric of the arguments made by many different voices and viewpoints on the economic stage. In order to assure that we are all on the same level playing field, I will introduce you in this lecture to some basic vocabulary and concepts. These modern-day terms and concepts will underlay our historical framework, so it's important to deal with them right away. So, as it says there, sit back, listen, read, and let the terms and concepts sink in. They won't all sink in at once. You'll hear and read them again and again, so don't worry if they seem foreign or strange to you now. By the end of the class, it will all start to come together, and maybe even before the end of the class. So as I said, the best way for us to learn is to begin at the end. That is close to the present. So let's start with this. I have carefully chosen a range of viewpoints, authors, etc., representing opinions ranging from conservative to liberal. That is purposeful. We should approach this class, as all history classes, from as objective a standpoint as humanly possible. Second, whether you're conservative, liberal, or right smack in the middle, you depend, just like I do, upon the global economy far more than you may realize. All of us benefit when the economy works well, and all of us suffer when it does not. Third, as we will see from the Roman Empire forward, there have been many economic viewpoints throughout history, and guess what? Many, if not most, of those historical economic explanations and theories were focused on one cause, one problem, one solution, one silver bullet to fix it all. However, you and I know that history and the economy are both very complex things. If there were a silver bullet, millions of human beings would have discovered it by now. So let us throw aside our collective hubris and admit that all of us, including me, have much to learn. In other words, if you think you have all the answers, I always say you're probably not asking the right questions. So let's learn to ask the right questions. And to ask the right questions, we need to realize that history is the study of change over time and place. And we're going to see how that works from the Roman Empire in the beginnings of the end of the Roman Empire, and how a lot of those causes of the end were at least economically based, through the Middle Ages and then into the, French Revolution and the First and Second Industrial Revolutions and the First Great Depression and the Second Great Depression and World War II and the Cold War and the Great Recession, Depression, whatever you want to call it, of 2008. Our questions and themes, because history is the study of change over time and place, hence our questions and themes change depending upon the historical period that we're discussing. And secondly, the questions may change dependent upon which civilization or nation or culture we are discussing. And we defined here civilization as humankind's attempt to bring stability and meaning to an uncertain and changing world. And you will especially see that in the economic sense of this class, because none of us like to all of a sudden be hit by a Great Depression or a Great Recession. None of us want to lose our jobs. None of us want to lose our savings or our pension. We all want to be a part of the workforce, and a very productive part of the workforce. And that means we really are seeking some stability to our work and some meaning to that as well. Now, successful civilizations, as I've said in other classes, are those that tend to monitor their military and political conditions, and we might have added here their economic conditions, right, fairly accurately. They recognize and reward their successful leaders, and they learn from their mistakes. Unsuccessful civilizations did not successfully monitor their political and military and economic conditions. Their perceptions of things are largely out of touch with reality. Their leaders tend to be inflexible or complacent. They tend to be ruled by cliques who are not open to new leadership, and they do not learn from their mistakes. Basically, all of the reverse of the above successful civilizations. Sometimes those civilizations, when they begin to fall, undergo what I call implosion, the combination of an internal and external problems, as the center of a nation or an empire weakens and the periphery becomes subject to invasions. We're especially going to see this with Rome, where internally it begins to have a meltdown economically. It takes a while for that meltdown to catch up with people. And when it becomes when the empire itself becomes weakened economically, and of course weakened also by many different political civil wars and strife, then the Roman Empire becomes susceptible to invasions from without, from whom we typically discussed in history as the barbarians. Anybody that Rome thought were outsiders and were not, quote-unquote, as civilized as they were. So here's kind of the Roman Empire. Here's an empire that is weakening, and looking on with very lustful eyes of, I'm going to attack you, kill you, and take you over, is the grinning barbarian. So weakness at the center and strength at the periphery outside. Add the two together and kaboom, the implosion occurs. Now, as Dr. Tenkate states, bad leaders seldom learn from their own mistakes and or often blame others for their mistakes. Mediocre leaders sometimes learn from their own mistakes. Sometimes. Good leaders learn from their own mistakes as well as from the mistakes of others. All these kind of themes, these are themes that you can, if you want to, take up in your critiques, as you read your assigned readings, as you find your own outside scholarly readings. If you think any of these themes fit in, feel free to run with them. That's why I mention them. Now, the third thing we need to consider. Defining poverty or prosperity throughout history is like trying to hit a moving target. Literally. Because the definitions keep changing. Before the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century, the vast majority of people in any nation or civilization, including Europe, were poor peasant farmers. That was as high as 90% or more of the people. By our modern standards, we would regard those overworked people, those agricultural workers, as poor, living in hovels, eating porridge, and dying young. But to them, they were not the poor, as there were others poorer than they were. On the other hand, the wealthy were living in stone houses, eating mutton, and had no understanding whatsoever of modern sanitary standards. So to us, the wealthy years ago, appear poor, but they weren't poor. So see, the definition of prosperity and poverty changes. But we do attempt to define poverty throughout history and today. And since we're starting at the end, let's look at one of the worldwide kind of definitions of poverty. Now, many modern nations have definitions of their own poverty line. Some of these are tied up with their census. And in 2015, many international agencies regard living on $2.50 or less per day as living in poverty. That would amount to about 3 billion people worldwide of approximately 7 billion people in the world. So about 3/7 of the world's population is living in poverty. But that's not even accurate, because $2.50 a day or less a day might not very well buy much in some places. So the definition of poverty really is contingent upon location, location, location. So who are the poor? Is this the poor, little tiny Tim, on the shoulders of his father? Right, from Dickens, A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was this author, British author, that wrote a lot about, right, the poor in the 19th century in Europe. Are they, as I took one trip of students, I began a program when I was at Thomas More with another professor. It was an alternative spring break program to Juarez, Mexico, and its sister city right across the Rio Grande, and that is El Paso, Texas. And we spent a lot of time working with the homeless, working with those who worked in the giant factories of Juarez and the so-called maquiladores. And this is a barrio in Juarez, Mexico called Inapra. And you can see that this house, like many houses in some of these barrios, is literally a hovel made out of whatever materials they could find. It could be corrugated tin, it could be cardboard, it could be pieces of wood, It could be concrete blocks. Obviously, very poor circumstances. Now, the question we might ask is, who would want to be homeless? Who would want to be poor? So, typically in history, people have kind of divided the poor into several categories. The first one is a really easy one for us to comprehend. The so-called, and I hate this term, you may grow to hate it as well, the deserving poor. The deserving poor would be people like widows and widowers, orphans, the disabled, perhaps the blind in years past, someone who had a horrible accident in times when there was no sort of unemployment insurance, no workman's compensation. These were people, hard-working people, who through circumstances not of their own became poor and probably would have spent the rest of their life being poor. Orphans would be another example. And orphans in the sense, of orphans from years ago with no parents. The undeserving poor are always, and again, I hate this term, but it's used, so we need to talk about it. The undeserving poor would be those folks who, for one reason or another, through their own decisions, poor decisions, have ended up poor. So maybe they're an addict of some kind, a drug addict or whatever. And perhaps through time, many times in the past, if somebody was a heroin addict, or an alcoholic, people looked at them and they didn't understand that these kinds of addictions were diseases. They saw this as, making bad decisions in their life. So, the undeserving poor were perhaps just the diseased poor or the misunderstood poor, but certainly there always will be in any society a small amount of people who might be undeserving poor. And so another way of just saying this is people who are kind of lazy, right? Or make poor decisions. But many of the world's poor are the working poor. They're people who have 1 or 2 or 3 jobs, or supplement their incomes, as you'll see in barrios like this. Some of these people in these kind of barrios in Juarez and other poor cities in South America are working at maquiladoras, working at factories, and also supplementing their income with other small jobs here and there. These are the folks who are working very long hours, sometimes not in full-time jobs, but in many part-time jobs, sometimes in seasonal labor. They're very oftentimes the first to be laid off when conditions become poor in terms of employment. People lay people off. Oftentimes, the poor are the first to go. This class really is going to concentrate on what we call the deserving poor and the working poor. And that makes sense because those are the folks who comprise the vast majority of whom we discuss as poor. Well, in-work poverty is another term for the working poor, and I want you to go to this article here, as well as Poverty in Europe, the Current Situation, and read these 2 little articles over to understand what the status of the poor in Europe are. And then I also want to take you to this rather interesting video, which is based, again, upon poor in America. These are clearly poverty in Europe, but misperceptions of the poor, which could apply not only, as they say, into the United States, but elsewhere in the poor. And I think it's very important for us to look at those misperceptions of the poor. Now, there are many non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental organizations throughout Europe and throughout the world are independent of any governmental entity. So, hence, the United Nations is not an NGO. It is not a non-governmental organization because it is an intergovernmental organization, right? Many nations belong to the United Nations. So I'm describing non-governmental organizations by giving you an example of a governmental organization that you know and you know well, and I encourage you to visit their website, and I encourage you with your critiques to visit their website at www.un.org because there are many statistics and reports on the poor in the world contained therein. Then there is something called Oxfam International, which is now worldwide, but it originally developed out of Oxford University, hence the name Ox, and it was about famine, hence FAM, Oxfam International. They have a lot of reports and statistics available at their website. I encourage you to go there. In Europe itself, there is Inequality Watch. I definitely encourage you to look there. The World Economic Forum, and in the U.S., the Working Poor Families Project. Now, there are a number of intergovernmental and governmental organizations that are known for having report statistics dealing with the poor. One of them is, as we said, the UN. Another is the World Bank. Then there's the International Monetary Fund, founded in 1945 at the Bretton Woods Conference. The European Union, which includes 28 nations as of 2015. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which was established in 1948 as the Marshall Plan. And always interesting is the CIA World Factbook, which has all kinds of statistics. So again, these are GOs, governmental organizations, and their websites that you might find very useful for your critiques. So we're going to look a little bit at some economic terminology. We're not going to go very much into detail. We're just going to introduce you to some things. And on our first test, like all of my tests that are objective, you can feel free to use your lectures, your lecture notes, your PowerPoints, your books, etc. They're open book tests. So again, don't get too flipped out, too frantic about some of the economic terminology. I like this little comic here where, you know, obviously the sales of this company are going down and the guy says, "I'll need this all again, sir," because he's run out of room on the little chart that he has. There are a number of types of economic systems in the world, and generally we look at three different types. A subsistence economy is an economy where goods and services are created for the use of the producers and their kinship groups. Where goods and services are created for the use of the producers and their kinship groups. So this is what you found, a subsistence economy, in many nomadic societies of prehistoric and historic times. So an example would be much of medieval Europe, you know, where on the manor, in the local area, you know, peasants lived, 90% or more of them were, right, farmers, and they worked to produce the crops, the livestock that would be used in that area. Some of them would then take, you know, the leather and make something else out of it, right? Or take, you know, the wool and make clothes out of that. There would be a blacksmith who would be taking, you know, iron ore that had been gotten locally or not too far away, making the tools that were needed. It was pretty much of a self-sustaining economy. and not a lot of trade was taking place. And the trade that was occurring was generally for a more luxury trade. So, the spices and the silks and so forth coming from the Silk Road from China and other exotic places. But again, these aren't the things that, the ordinary peasant person is going to be using. These are the things that, the upper class might be using. So very, very limited trade. And in fact, most of the peasants would never have really left, the area of their village in all of their lifetime. Maybe they would go once in a lifetime on a pilgrimage to a shrine, a cathedral, a church somewhere nearby, or not too far away, but generally things were very insular. Now, a commercial or free market economy is the production of goods and services for exchange. The production of goods and services for exchange in competitive markets where price and availability are determined by supply and demand forces. So the production of goods and services for exchange in competitive markets where price and availability are determined by supply and demand. Well, you all know what this is, because this is the kind of free market economy that we live in today. This is Europe today. This is the supply and demand world of, it's the capitalistic world. It's the United States, it's Germany, it's Japan, it's the United Kingdom, it's France, it's all kinds of places. Then there are planned economies, where the production of goods and services was usually distributed by a governmental agency in quantities and at prices determined by the government. A planned economy would be the old socialist Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc communist nations of Europe before they started to fall in 1989 and 90 and so forth. So this is more of an historic description of an economy that really doesn't exist, an economic type of economy that doesn't exist too much in the world, exists in Cuba, somewhat, a little bit in China, etc., although the free market there has pretty well invaded things. But we need to know what these are, because when we look at medieval Europe, we're going to be looking at subsistence economies. Europe today, a commercial free market, and we're going to see how the first and second industrial revolutions and urbanization lead to this, to what we know today. And then, of course, all that stuff about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and socialism and communism and, the 1917 revolution in Russia that brings about, the Soviet Union. And then after World War II, all those Eastern Bloc communist nations. Well, another thing that we'll be referring to is GDP, the gross domestic product. You've probably heard this term before, and it gives some idea of how much a country's economy is worth. And you've probably wondered, well, what's it all about? What does it include? The gross domestic product is the value of all goods and services produced within a country, within a nation. For example, let's take the United States. It would be, in 1 year, all of the goods and services produced within the U.S., whether or not the producer is a U.S. firm or a foreign one located here. So if it is, an automobile produced by General Motors or Ford in Detroit or one of its, American factories, that would count as our GDP. And if it is an automobile produced by Toyota in Georgetown, Kentucky, or Honda, which is obviously a foreign firm, in Marysville, Ohio, etc., that would count in GDP. And it would count whether it's made by an American worker or whether it's made by someone who's not an American worker, say maybe a Japanese worker who works at the headquarters of Toyota North America and is just here for a few years. And it consists of 4 categories. It consists of personal consumption expenditures. That is what all of us in our private households do in terms of buying clothes, cars, jewelry, groceries, healthcare, etc. But it also includes the domestic investment outlays. You know, that corporations and businesses have in office buildings and office equipment, factories, industrial machinery, farm equipment, new homes for families. It includes government purchases, both those for consumption's sake and investment purposes. So roads and bridges and airports and school lunches, etc. But it does not include transfer payments like in the United States, Social Security, disability, welfare payments, unemployment benefits, Medicare, and Medicaid. And lastly, it includes the export balance, that is exports minus imports. Now, if we would look at GDP rank order, and this comes from the CIA World Fact Book, which I accessed in February 2015. We would see that the largest GDP they're estimating it from 2013, is the United States, followed by the European Union, which we've already discussed, so there's Europe, followed by China, then India, then Japan, then I've got, again, highlighted here, those in Europe, Germany, Russia, United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, and way down here the Netherlands, but don't be at all thinking that the Netherlands isn't hot stuff, because we're going to show you here the Netherlands is hot, very hot. Current or nominal GDP means GDP in current prices. You know, so like in 2015 prices. Real GDP, and real here means objective, measures GDP in constant prices. That is, prices adjusted for inflation. So real GDP could compare the GDP of 1950 with the GDP of 2015, and it would adjust it for inflation. Per capita means for each person, so GDP per capita means a country's GDP divided by its population. It's that simple. Well, we talked about the trade balance, you know, that's involved in figuring out the GDP of a nation. But a trade balance is just that stuff that is very tangible. What we're using currently, nowadays, to kind of look at that balance is what is called the current account balance. The current account balance of any particular nation includes four categories. Number one, the merchandise trade. This is the visible trade. These are the tangible goods. And you get that trade balance by taking the exports and goods minus the imports and goods. And we know that typically the United States has a big trade imbalance because we import more than we export. Now, the current account balance also includes invisible trade, which is services. So services are not goods, right? They're services. They could be consulting services, all kinds of other services. The return of investment paid to all foreign investors minus the return of investment received by all domestic investors abroad. So I am, and you may be, anybody who has a pension may be a domestic investor abroad. That is, I live in the United States, right? And my pension fund probably is investing in some companies abroad. So I would get a return of that investment in my pension fund. Hopefully I'll see it someday when I retire, if I live that long. That is that second part of the equation. The return of investment paid to all foreign investors means that there are foreign investors who invest in the United States. And that includes people from all over the world, and companies from all over the world, and governments from all over the world, like China, which has picked up a lot of our debt. And so that also is considered in the current account balance. And then the next thing is unilateral transfers. These are both government and private transfers sent abroad. For example, say a Mexican worker working here in the United States sending part of his American paycheck home, to help his needy family in Mexico. Or let's say the U.S. government sending foreign aid abroad. That would also be included in the current account balance. So economists like to look at the current account balance to see things nowadays. And so I've picked up from the March 7th, 2015 Economist, the latest current account balance. And you're going to notice that they're going to give a bunch of different things here. Gross domestic product, the latest over the last quarter and throughout 2015 to date. Industrial productions, consumer prices, the unemployment rate, that's pretty significant to look at. The budget balance as a percentage of GDP, so this would be the government budget as a percentage of our GDP. For instance, the United States is spending 2.5% of its GDP on, we're 2.5% behind on our GDP for our governmental expenses, interest rates, etc. But here we want to look at the current account balance, the latest 12 months, and this is in billions of dollars, and the percent of GDP. The United States has a current account deficit of $388 billion per year, which is roughly 2.2% of our GDP. So as a percentage of our economy, it's rather minuscule, and it has been dropping, especially since the United States is becoming more energy independent through a variety of reasons. Some of that has been nuclear power, some of it is wind power, some of it is, fracking and finding more oil resources, some of this is coal, and also the dropping price of oil worldwide, which means that this current account balance will drop. At its height some years ago, this was more like $600 billion a year. Now, the next country, okay, we need to point that out, okay? Now, we need to see how strong is Europe? Well, in the euro, those 28 nations all counted together, they have an account balance of plus $309 billion. So Europe's economy is still fairly strong, but notice this over here, an 11.2% unemployment rate. That's a bit troublesome. Germany has a 200, so of this euro area, that has to include those countries that are doing very well, like Germany, and those that are not doing so well. And you can see France is not doing as well, right? But not doing poorly either. That deficit is only a little bit over 1% of its GDP. But Germany is doing very well. In fact, Germany has the healthiest account balance surplus, the largest current account balance surplus in the world is Germany, followed by China. Okay, we're not going to count the euro area here. We're going to now go by nation. So the largest surplus is Germany, followed by China, followed by Saudi Arabia for obvious reasons, namely oil, followed by South Korea, and then closely on their heels, the Netherlands. Look at the tiny little Netherlands at almost $92 billion surplus in its current account, which is over 9% of its GDP. If you're going to look at GDP, tiny the Netherlands is doing the best, especially in terms of this percentage of GDP. But also because it's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth largest current account balance in the world. Now, there's also something called the Group of Seven, which began as the Group of Six, then was called the Group of Eight, And in 2014, it became the Group of Seven because the members decided to temporarily suspend Russia because of its invasion of the Crimea. So then it became the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, really among the world's largest economies, plus the European Union. So it's 7 plus the European Union, and if Russia ever gets back, it'll be the Group of 8 plus the European Union. So they keep changing the name. All right, another kind of idea to look at here is comparative advantage and also outsourcing. Comparative advantage argues that countries, nations that is, should produce what they can at their greatest advantage, and that they should import other items where they have a disadvantage. So, to give a German example, Germany is known for its highly educated workforce. Some of those workers are educated in the German universities and some in the fantastic German technical schools. So the German manufacturing is very high tech. It's not a low-tech enterprise. So to Germany, its comparative advantage would be for it to concentrate on its high-tech industries because that's where it has an advantage, and an advantage is in a very educated workforce. It might not make as much sense for Germany to sit and to make shirts and pants and dresses and so forth because that isn't necessarily its comparative advantage, and it can get it by importing it from someplace else where it is a comparative advantage. So there are certain Caribbean countries, for instance, or China, although less and less so, Southeast Asia, that have, say, a comparative advantage in making clothing because they have a larger uneducated workforce and more people in that workforce and a greater labor supply, so it might make more sense where the labor costs are lower. The comparative advantage of China would be in making inexpensive items that don't require the workforce to have a lot of education. Now, sometimes what has affected our economies, particularly those in Europe, in the United States, and in the so-called developed world, is outsourcing. And outsourcing is when literally we move jobs out of a nation, out of a country, and perhaps the most vivid example of outsourcing in the United States is whenever you have a computer problem and you call up the software manufacturer, or you have a problem with your internet connection and you end up being tied up and somebody is answering the phone in India, for instance, right? And that's because a lot of these jobs have been outsourced to India. I like this little comic. We're considering outsourcing your job. Could you explain to this guy in Guatemala whatever it is you do around here? Well, the more developed world, which includes a lot of Europe, has a higher percentage of people engaged in secondary and tertiary activities, not in primary activities. So in service type of activities, accountants, engineers, professors, lawyers, any number of different activities that do not really involve manufacturing. And a lot of the more developed world's manufacturing is becoming very robotic. And even a lot of the manufacturing moving back to the United States does not really demand that much traditional labor, but a lot of it is robotic. These more developed world countries, like in Europe, have a higher per capita GDP generally. GNP is the old name, gross national product. We now prefer GDP, the gross domestic product. A more balanced distribution of wealth, although that is changing, and it's changing rapidly. A higher per capita inanimate energy use, so they tend to absorb more energy resources, but they have a higher life expectancy, a higher literacy rate, and in a population pyramid, they have a more even distribution of age groups. In the less developed world, there's a higher percentage of people engaged in primary activities, so, in agricultural and mining pursuits. And sometimes there's an existence really of a dual economy, of two separate economic systems within a region. And this is common in the less developed world, where one system is geared to local needs and another to the export market. They have lower per capita GDP. Sometimes wealth is concentrated in fewer hands, lower per capita energy consumption, lower life expectancy, lower literacy rate, and the population pyramid is all skewed because a higher percentage of the population usually consists of children and adolescents. Now I want to introduce you to one final concept, and it's by a man who was born in 1952 in Chicago, and his name is Francis Fukuyama. He's Japanese-American. He received his BA in Classics from Cornell University and his PhD in Government at Harvard University. And he is the author of The End of History and the Last Man. Formerly a neoconservative, he has departed ranks from the neocons. But let's look at what he talks about in The End of History and the Last Man. This book, published in 1992, had its origins as an article appearing in the National Interest in 1989. Fukuyama states that liberal democracy, and look when this was written, after the fall of Eastern Germany in 1989-90 and all of the fall of the Eastern Bloc countries, he says that liberal democracy has conquered rival ideologies like hereditary monarchy, fascism, and most recently communism. More than that, however, liberal democracy may constitute the end point of mankind's ideological evolution. And the final form of human government is such, literally the end of history. Now, that is important because there is this sense since 1989-90 and the fall of communist regimes throughout the world that capitalism and liberal democracy has won. And that sense of things, while it may be true for the time being, we don't know if that's going to be true for the future, has sometimes distracted us from the fact that there are problems. There are problems remaining with economic policies worldwide and in Europe and in the United States, with a growing disparity of inequality, a growing inequality between the very wealthiest and the very poorest. Neocons or neoconservatives are especially prevalent in the United States, but also in Europe, and I want you to kind of understand, their importance in all of this. I think the best definition is by Irvin Kristol, who is the founder of the Public Interest, which is a journal, as well as the National Interest, and they're both neocon journals. And he says that a neoconservative is, quote, a liberal who was mugged by reality. The greatest influence of the neocons was in the administration of George W. Bush after 9/11, and that's a time period where we saw the Bush Doctrine about preemptive war, the involvement in the Iraq War, and tax cuts. So what do the neocons believe? And this is very important because this kind of outlines the argument. And don't forget that politics and foreign policy are very much involved with economics throughout the world too. You can't separate foreign policy and politics from economics. Neocons support the spread of democracy throughout all areas of the world. They're anti-communist, anti-dictatorship, anti-terrorism. They believe in preemptive strikes if necessary, the Bush Doctrine, as well as the curtailment of liberties for national security purposes. And they believe in free trade, and we're going to talk a lot about free trade and how that gets started with the British Empire. Their domestic policies, generally they were disappointed by the lack of success of programs like Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society and what they saw as the amoralism, the counterculture of the 1960s and the 1970s. This is something, by the way, that is repeated in Europe because a number of neocons there are disappointed in all of the governmental programs, entitlement programs that were established in many of the nations of Europe, as well as this kind of countercultural revolution that was also occurring in Europe in the 60s and 70s. But the thing that makes them different from other conservatives, and you know, I didn't come up with this term, it's kind of, you know, weird and maybe even hilarious, but paleo-conservatives like Patrick Buchanan, is that the neocons are more liberal on issues involving things like abortion in the United States, affirmative action, immigration, same-sex marriage, etc. So they're basically saying, well, you know, we want the government to perform according to certain, you know, views, but when it comes to these other kind of issues, you know, our stance is not particularly necessarily conservative. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for your attention, and please email me if you